Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the Corporate Social Responsibility and Economic Development web seminar. My name is Michelle Thompson, and I'm an Economic Development Associate at IEDC, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Today's session will provide some helpful information that you can use to incorporate some of the corporate social responsibility objectives of your community's businesses into your own economic development strategy. So before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes. During the webinar, we will have all lines muted. Please type all of your questions into the questions box, and I'll pose them to our speakers during the Q&A period. Within 24 hours, you'll receive an email with an electronic evaluation. Please complete it, as IEDC staff does use the feedback to plan future sessions. Furthermore, you'll receive a link to download the presentation at the end of the evaluation. So this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for the next hour. Joining us today, we have Mark DeCourcy and Alec Gorinsky. And Mark is the Senior Vice President of the Corporate Citizenship Center of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, which is located in Washington, D.C. Mark, would you like to share a few comments about yourself and your organization with our audience?
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's so glad to join everyone from IEDC, and really thank you for all the amazing work that you do with all of your members. It's a simpatico relationship between IEDC members and chamber members, and particularly local chambers of commerce. So we couldn't be more thrilled to be part of this conversation today. And hats off to Jeff for your CEO for thinking of me to be part of this whole discussion, because what we see as corporate citizenship currently is so very important to economic development. We'll get into that during the presentation. Just a little bit about me. I've been here for more than 4 years, and prior to that, I was Chief of Staff of the American Red Cross. I spent 8 years at the Red Cross, and before that, I was on Capitol Hill and in the administration way back in time, but have worked with companies throughout it all. To really figure out how the private sector can have a positive social impact. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Michelle, and look forward to discussing corporate citizenship as we get into the presentation.
Well, thanks, Mark, and we're really glad to have you today. And again, also joining you is Alec Gorinsky. And Alec is the Vice President of Community Development and Corporate Philanthropy for First National Bank. He's also the President of First National Community Development Corporation, and he's based out of Omaha, Nebraska. So welcome, Alec, and would you like to share a few bit more tidbits about yourself with our audience?
Sure, thank you, and thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and right alongside Mark, someone who's got a really strong depth of experience and knowledge to pull from to lead this conversation. So I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. You know, I've been doing community development and corporate philanthropy and philanthropy for about a decade now, and I consider myself a technical expert, an investor, and really a partner in making some community development concepts possible in many of our local communities. And I've been doing it on behalf of governments, local governments in particular, on behalf of nonprofit organizations, and more recently with this company and a prior company on behalf of private sector companies. And as Mark pointed out, companies create a really strong value add to economic development. Not a word that I've used, economic development, that is not a word that I've historically used to describe my work, but that is exactly what it is. It's the development of our communities, and of which the economies are an integral part. And so eager to talk to you about this concept.
Well, we're really looking forward to the exciting discussion that we're going to have today. So again, thanks to both of you. And without further delay, I will now turn the presentation over to, I believe Mark will be presenting first. So take it away, Mark.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So a little bit about the Corporate Citizenship Center, and I think to better understand us, you have to make the distinction of the difference between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber of Commerce Foundation. The U.S. Chamber, much like all the state and local chambers that are in the communities across the country, these chambers exist to help companies do well, to create that environment where companies can be successful. That's no secret, and that's part of the fabric of the American way. the Chamber Foundation takes it a step further, where we want to help companies do good. And we believe that the do well and do good are self-reinforcing. If we're able to have companies be successful, they can give more back to the communities. And when they give more back to the communities, we hope that they're recognized and rewarded for doing such, so they can do more well. And that's the philosophy that we have here at the Chamber Foundation. The Corporate Citizenship Center is a function that has been around for about 17 years. We are not under different names, but part of the Chamber Foundation is a 501c3. The Chamber itself is structured as a 501c6. But the Corporate Citizenship Center, or CCC, we really want to help companies just make the world a better place. And the way we do that is we talk to these companies all across the country about what they're most interested in terms of leveraging their core competencies, their philanthropy, their shared value mission to address societal challenges. So in doing that, we talk to them, and you can see on this list here, there are a number of issues. They're pretty big bucket issues. There's a lot of sub-buckets underneath that, if you will, where we're able to figure out where we can optimize, this corporate involvement. And when I say corporate, I mean the entire private sector involvement to address these issues, either straight up as a company or business, or partnering with nonprofits, partnering with state and local government, even the federal government at times, to really make the world a better place. We have about 150 of the country's largest companies support us financially to help us meet that mission that I just described. But it's important to note that the outputs from the Corporate Citizenship Center are for everyone, and that is our C3 mission. So as we get into this, you'll see that a lot of references to big companies, but these big companies are only examples. Everything that we do is for the entire private sector. And as I mentioned, we can't do it alone. So what we found, and we'll get more into this later as well, that strange bedfellows, unlikely partners of the private sector, of the U.S. Chamber, really help us deliver on that mission. So take a look at this slide. You'll see this logo garden of organizations that help us in particular areas like National Geographic and our environment work. Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation on diversity and inclusion. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in our health work. The United Nations, particularly UN Women and Women and Girls Empowerment, both here and around the world. Or even FEMA when it comes to disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery as we bundle that up into community resilience. And then we leverage the media. USA Today is just one partner that we have to communicate all this. Because at the end of the day, we believe that companies here in the U.S. don't get enough credit for the good stuff they do. And it's not about making them feel good, about giving them the spotlight, but it's about inspiring others to do more. And that's one of the great benefits, I think, of the Chamber Network, where it's just not the U.S. Chamber, but all of these state and local chambers around the country. There's well over 2,000 of them that we're able to tap into. When you add up all their memberships, about 3 million businesses. And then we have the added benefit of about 117 American chambers of commerce overseas. So that's a pretty big network. And if we're able to find best practices, share them, convene unlikely partners, we can make some real social impact. And that's the core of corporate social responsibility as we see it.
I'll take a moment to share just a little bit about the company for whom I work, and not going to dive into our corporate social responsibility just yet until we get into some more of the meat of the discussion on what CSR is and how it's applied. But our company is one that I'm proud to work for. We're a financial institution, a bank. It's been around for 160 years. We are the largest privately owned bank in the country. We're a family-owned bank. We consider ourselves a community bank, yet we're still a very respectable size of $21 billion in assets. And so we like to refer to ourselves as a great big small bank. We're big enough to handle and tackle some great challenges, while at the same time nimble enough to be responsive to the needs to our local communities. We've been we benefited from some great recognition from our customers and from the industry as a whole, being named Best Bank by Money in a few of our states, not all of them. And we've received a recognition from Forbes for a number of years. One thing I want to say about ourselves is that, you know, we view ourselves as having a purpose of being truly an economic engine from our community, to our communities rather. You know, if you think back, you know, at the time 160 years ago, when towns were developing and communities were popping up, one of the first buildings to pop up was a bank, you know, pretty critical component of a landscape of a community in a town. And that's how we got our start. And we continue to view ourselves in that role today, is that financial institutions are economic engines driving growth and progress and sustainment of communities. And that's something that we realize every day through our delivery of our products and services that are done in a way that recognizes the value that these deliver to our communities, while at the same time delivering a structured CSR, corporate social responsibility program in a way that complements the purpose we have as a company. We are also something that was mentioned in my title, which is a community development corporation. We are not unique in that. First National Bank owns a community development corporation. Many banks do. It's a tool we use to realize some of our strategic activities in our communities. And so it's not a brand we put out there often. We are First National Bank, but it is a mechanism that allows us to do some more innovative things.
Thanks, Alec. And now if you just take a minute to talk about really the definition of CSR and what is corporate social responsibility, and it's evolved over time, right? And one of the things that we here at the Chamber Foundation and the Corporate Citizenship Center, we tend not to use the word corporate social responsibility for the very reason of responsibility might imply obligation. And we don't really see it as an obligation as to why these companies are investing in their communities. They're doing it because it is the right thing to do, but it's also a good thing for them to do in order for them to grow their businesses. So we don't ever want people to think that companies have to do things. And if it becomes a mandate or some sort of government intervention or directive, I think you lose the spirit of it all. So when we talk about CSR, we want to make sure that companies are able to optimize their social investments in communities wherever they have an interest. Sometimes it's just where they have facilities or employees. Sometimes it's where they have market interest. Sometimes it's where they might want to have a presence. We're basically motivationally agnostic as to why companies are doing this. What we really want to do is focus on the outcomes, and the outcomes are a better society, and it can be in any number of areas, from health to sustainability in the environment, to jobs in the economy, to education and workforce skills, to diversity and inclusion, all the things I mentioned at the beginning of this slide deck. So that is why we're in on this all the way, and all the companies that we work with see it that way as well. And we're hoping that we can inspire more companies to follow suit. And the First National Bank is a great example of leading the way in the states in which they operate as a great corporate citizen. So we're going to talk a little bit just about the evolution of CSR. It started really about 20 or 30 years ago as people defined it as philanthropy or just charity, check writing, right? So I mentioned I used to work at the Red Cross. Red Cross loves companies who write checks, and that's how they deliver on their mission. But it's evolved over time. And it's evolved where it's just not about the company standing up at the holiday party listing all the charities that they donated money to. We still hope companies will do that, but they can deliver so much more value. So it's not only about their treasure, but also about their time and their talent, about their core competencies. So if you're a bank, I mean, you can help people learn financial education and financial wellness, right? If you're a healthcare company, you can teach people how to be healthier. It's not just about check writing anymore. So one other thing I'd like to note, and don't misinterpret the chart that we're looking at while it's evolving, it doesn't mean that any of these strategies are going away, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's corporate social responsibility or corporate citizenship. It's evolving. And into what you see on the far right-hand side is that shared value, which I mentioned before, where it's something in it for the society, for the community, and something in it for the company, because we believe that a strong and healthy economy, which is what all of you are focused on, is really going to help address a lot of these social challenges. And once they're addressed, it's going to make these communities more competitive, more economically successful, and that's going to benefit everyone who lives and visits there.
Alec here. I want to use this as a chance to talk a little bit more about that shared value that Mark just spoke to, which is a really important concept that we recognize and we try to live in many of the things that we do. And what we have here is an image that was published in the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago, and in a piece about specifically about corporate philanthropy, and very applicable to the broader and the evolved perspective of citizenship and social responsibility that Mark alluded to. So really, this is a theoretical foundation for corporate social responsibility that's been presented by the Harvard Business Review. Here's what the message that's trying to come across here is that in the context of CSR, there are really two types of decisions to be made here, or in the context of companies, at least maybe absent of CSR, or not exclusive to CSR rather. Representing the x-axis on the bottom there, there are decisions that produce that are pure business decisions, and they produce pure economic benefit for the company. What vendor do we go with? Personnel expenses in many cases, supply expenses, IT resources. Many of those decisions produce a pure benefit, pure economic benefit for companies, and rightfully so. Many decisions should produce, every decision should produce economic benefit for companies. Along the y-axis there are most, those historical CSR decisions, I think, that Mark alluded to. The donations we made at the Christmas party example. Those are pure philanthropy. And yes, they produce a meaningful social benefit, and ones that we should be appreciative of and proud of. What I think that we're talking about, this shared value, is that space between, where there is combined social and economic development. And that is the sweet spot according to this article, corporate philanthropy, and more broadly, citizenship and social responsibility for companies. Some great examples that Mark alluded to, and some others might be a company that recognizes that they're going to have a need for a better IT workforce in the coming years, and at the same time recognizing that maybe their local community doesn't really have the pipeline of talent in that area. So how can a company forge partnerships with community colleges, universities, with workforce development organizations, which is an obligation of many economic development corporations, to grow the IT workforce locally? There is a great social benefit to be realized there with increased wages and economic capability of those individuals. At the same time, you're also getting to realize the benefit of opportunities for a stronger employee base. You could be a restaurant that depends on organic produce, or and realizing that maybe that's not something that's really locally available, and maybe it's in your best interest and your community's best interest to cultivate more farmers that engage in organic practices. So again, there's a social benefit there, as well as a benefit to your supply chain that you may not have realized before. And then a great example Mark alluded to might be an insurance company. An insurance company would probably prefer to have a healthier community from which feel fit squarely in that sweet spot, right? Live in a way that is both organizations and external partners that can realize some of those values.
That's spot on, Alec, and I think we're about to talk about some of these strategies for CSR and the intersection of economic development. So in a shared value model, why do companies engage in CSR? One is, first, it's everything in the community is tied together. Businesses, as we know, are only as strong as the community, and vice versa. There's also issues tied to each other. For example, and Alec mentioned some of these. A child will have trouble succeeding in school if they go hungry. What we know, and I think what IEDC can really focus on, and its members can focus on, is the fact that we see this time and time with elected officials, and even with chambers of commerce. You're always competing to have companies either stay in your community or come to your community and to do business, to settle, to build, to manufacture, to employ, to sell. So what we want to do is we want to address some of these underlying social determinants that might inhibit companies from doing that. So again, oftentimes you'll see a mayor or a governor say, come to our community because it is the best educated or most skilled. It has a great infrastructure. Maybe it has a great natural environment. More and more, we're starting to see them making additional arguments around we're the healthiest, or we're healthier than the other community that you're considering. We're diverse, we're resilient, and these are new words in the marketing scheme of why you should do business in our community, but they're important, and they just can't be words. They have to be addressed, and I think the communities that address them in a way that makes them marketable is going to have a leg up on the competition, whether it's just across the river or across an ocean. So I think, Alice, we wanted to give you first crack at this to talk about First National Bank's community vision and focus areas.
Yeah, what I like about this slide is that I assure you that Mark and I we did coordinate these, but we didn't compare notes that strongly. What you see here isn't just an application of what Mark presented on the previous slide. It was created completely independent of that, and something that we created a number of years ago. And I was tickled that there are so many similarities between these two things. So just like Mark pointed out, that this community ecosystem, businesses are only as strong as their community. That is almost verbatim what our community vision is. When we think about our, I'm going to use the word citizenship because I agree with Mark. It's a good word to describe this. Our citizenship philosophy is that we want to have successful communities in all the places that we operate. Because a successful community breeds or is a better environment for us to operate in, plain and simple. And so we've identified these 8 assets, elements that make up a successful community. And each one of these things needs to be strong and present in order for the community to be successful and therefore us to be successful. And if any piece is missing or if a link is broken, you can see how the community of a whole is not as successful. So if you've got an individual that didn't have the same resources, education resources as maybe another did, therefore not able to get a well-paying job and participate in our economy and have a stable housing environment and pay for health care and participate in some of the elements of the soul of our community, like our culture. That one example multiplied by, in many cases, the 15% of our nation's population that is in poverty, you can see how that can have a pretty detrimental effect on a community as a whole, and then the companies that operate in those communities as a whole. So if you could just close that gap, then you've got a better environment to work in, a much better environment to do business in. And so that's what our vision is. And we've actually specifically identified even 3 specific assets that we think are even more connected to our success as a company. And that's a stable housing environment, a really active, prosperous local economy, and a workforce that is trained and ready to take advantage of some of those employment opportunities. Between a couple of years ago in 2020, we've made a commitment that we were going to reinvest $85 million and a significant number of our employees' hours back into our communities to realize some very tangible goals, some very tangible metrics that align with those areas: housing units, job creation and retention, and moving people towards self-sufficiency. And these are things that aren't realized first and foremost independently. Mark talked about his partners early on, and we recognize that it is because of our partnerships with external organizations, many of which are economic development organizations, is because of our partnerships with them, and it is through our investments with those partnerships that many of these objectives are able to be realized. And it's also not just a citizenship department activity, but it is truly our bank that gets behind some of these and many of these initiatives and tries to leverage the ways in which we operate, our products and services, and our real estate footprint even to try to realize some of these objectives. So that's a way we've applied what Mark talked about on the previous slide.
Thank you, Alec. And what I'd like to do is just go through a couple of different communities that we've experienced significant efforts and investments to really turn the needle in an appropriate direction to solve some issues that were really, beleaguering, these communities from growth. So our first example is Oklahoma City. And we came across Oklahoma City during our Health Means Business campaign with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. You remember they were one of the unlikely partners that I posted up at the beginning of the deck. RWJ is the largest healthcare foundation in the country. It was founded by the Johnson family from that small healthcare company in New Jersey called Johnson & Johnson. So they have a significant footprint in the culture of health efforts here in the United States. And what we did during our Health Means Business campaign with them is we went to different cities to talk about how health can actually, in the health of the community and its population, can actually have a positive effect on growth and have a positive effect on communities actually being successful in attracting other businesses. So in Oklahoma City, this is what we found. Back in the 90s, the community, and these are stories that came from the community leaders. Back in the 90s, Oklahoma City was a finalist site for a major airlines maintenance facility, bringing thousands of jobs to the city. They lost that bid, and when they asked the company's executives after they visited downtown and had made their decision, here's what the company executives said: "We just can't picture living here." Imagine how shocking that is for a local mayor or for an economic development department or even the community to absorb. We just can't see ourselves living here. So Oklahoma City did the right thing. Instead of blaming the airline, they took it upon themselves to fix the issue, the underlying issue. So what they did is they funded an economic development projects through what they called the Metropolitan Area Projects, MAPS. It led to over $1 billion in public-private investment and completely revitalized downtown. It improved their schools, their cultural centers, their wellness facilities, their parks, their playgrounds. They even put in an Olympic rowing center. We visited Oklahoma City, and it's growing. As many of you may have read or heard or even seen, it's totally transformed. And it did that in a matter of 10 plus years, where they were able to turn the needle in the right direction. So, MAPS funding, it was voter approved and managed by the city sales tax. Not for every city, not for every municipality. Please don't quote me that I'm, advocating for tax increases. I'm not. It is situational. It fit their situation. So during the past 23 years, they were able to raise all this money for arts, health, and education, and it made a huge difference. Now it's a national model for public and private collaboration in healthy community economic development. It has benefits, long-term commitment and investment in the community. It has workforce wellness components to it that in and itself pay off. As you might imagine, a healthier community incurs less healthcare costs. And if you are an employer, that's good news. If you're an employee, that's good news too. So the local business community, working with the local chamber, came together with these community partners to invest and strengthen the city. That's really made a huge difference. I know that we had someone from Fort Worth registered to participate in this webinar, and I just want to, hats off to them and to Mayor Betsy Price there too. We did one of our visits to Fort Worth to talk about their Blue Zones project, which is part of their Healthiest City initiative. And it's just another example. You don't have to go all in on economic development if you can't, get the community support and/or funding. But what Fort Worth has done is, they've become a much healthier city, and it's much more attractive to do business and to locate your business or keep your business in Fort Worth because of that. And that's really, so important. You have, these public-private partnerships, working and firing in unison. And I can't stress enough that everybody wins. Another example we have is Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it's not just enough to think about employment, and you can think about the entire picture to remain competitive. So in Grand Rapids, there's a high number of higher education institutions in and around the community, but it has one of the lowest college attainment ratios of any city with an average or better high school attainment level. What that all means is most everyone finishes high school, but not that many go to college. And while, Grand Rapids' older economic model may have rewarded workers with a high school diploma in the past, this changing economy that we're in, the new economy, needs a higher educated workforce that has brought together lots of community stakeholders to encourage education. So they don't lose out on new job and business opportunities for the lack of workers. Pretty soon, if Grand Rapids didn't try to address this, they'd be stuck with this problem that is really happening all across America, that you've got people without jobs, and you also have areas with jobs without people. So companies in Grand Rapids like Amway, which is headquartered there, is taking an active role in these projects because they want to help ensure the company will have access to the skilled workforce in the future. So there's that shared value, right? It's good for the community, but it's also good for Amway. They have thousands of employees there, and when they want to hire more or replace the ones that are there because they retire or move on, they need a pool to draw from. And if you do nothing, Amway would have a hard time with talent recruitment. So we're working with Amway in Grand Rapids to help break down these community silos, bring together the right stakeholder groups, and foster a collaboration in Grand Rapids' case for healthier cities. We hosted an event last October with Amway, and we're going to continue to build out and strengthen that city, and hopefully it will become a model, just like Oklahoma City was, for other communities around the country. Another one of our ways we view this is through the license to operate, and sometimes this becomes controversial. In this case, this was not controversial because the company dealt with it the right way. So we really want to talk about how companies are leveraging CSR to bolster their license to operate, whether it's here in the US or around the world. And what CSR can do, or corporate citizenship if you prefer that term, it can help build trust and goodwill in these local communities. So this helps companies with new business investments and expansions. The example we'd like to talk about is MGM. And you see this massive building in front of you on the screen. This is MGM National Harbor. It is in National Harbor, Prince George's County, Maryland. It is literally probably 4 or 5 miles from downtown Washington, right down the Potomac. So at the end of 2013, MGM had a license to operate in 3 states, Nevada, Mississippi, and Michigan. And at the beginning of 2014, anyone from the region here where I live, they knew another state was doing this, and that was Maryland. There are a lot of factors that led MGM to winning the bid to build their resort in National Harbor. But if you talk to the MGM executive team, they'll tell you, and we have research to prove this because we went back and read all the public meeting notes from Prince George's County as well as the state of Maryland, that MGM's previous CSR efforts in Michigan and Nevada and Mississippi really played a role in building community trust and goodwill that led to this expansion in Maryland. And by the way, they're also now in Massachusetts under construction. So there are 2 takeaways I just want to point out when it comes to license to operate. The company's character matters, and it could also transfer to the entire private sector of a particular community. If they behave in a responsible way and become a good community partner, they'll be rewarded for it, and that will play into license to operate. At the moment, MGM's proposal is considered, there are traditional market performance, profit and stock price and operational efficiencies that they talked about, but they really focused on public goodwill and trust. This isn't a one-time engagement for MGM because they want to continue expanding both here and around the world. And it wasn't just pointing to awards, whether it was in diversity and CSR, all the cash that they gave to local nonprofits. They actually put their money where their mouth was And I just want to cite a couple figures that this project here, and it's enormous. It was under construction, and they built it for $1.4 billion. Now, they made promises to Prince George's County, Maryland, as well as some of the other surrounding municipalities. And in Prince George's County, 27% of the total construction work hours went to local residents. That accounted to almost 2,000 Prince George's County, Maryland employees were hired. The facility itself has 4,000 full-time employees now that it's finished. And of these 4,000 jobs, about half of them went to local people. So you might imagine what an economic boost that is to one of the poorest counties in the state, where, by comparison's sake, for those of you who are familiar with Washington, D.C. or visited here, across the river is Fairfax County, Virginia. And Fairfax County, Virginia has about 2 percentage points less unemployment than Prince George's County. People tend to have healthier lives. They have more income. But this is something that helps even it out. And it's only separated by a river, where now PG County, particularly this part of PG County, people are employed, they have good incomes, they have retirement accounts, they have healthcare benefits, all because of economic development. And what you can't see in this picture is there's another adjacent facility to MGM National Harbor, where there's a Gaylord Hotel and a whole bunch of stores and hotels and restaurants and facilities there, both employing people and also servicing the greater Washington metro area. All because the people of Prince George's County trusted MGM, because MGM had a great CSR program, and not just Johnny-come-latelys, but they've been at it for years. I think the last example on this I just wanted to share with you is Shinola. For those of you who have been to Detroit or soon to be in Chicago, Shinola, they had embarked on making watches and bicycles and leather journals and jewelry and even audio equipment. And they were founded in 2011. But the company stuck to one of its core mission and created jobs and products that everyone could be proud of, especially the workers. So they hired hundreds of people who were previously laid off from the automakers in Detroit, trained them up, equipped them with the technical skills and craftsmanship to succeed in not just the workplace, but also in life. And this investment in Detroit is an example of how a company, through jobs and investments, can become an active member in the community that it operates. So again, licensed to operate. If you talk to a lot of people in Detroit or now Chicago, Shinola is one of those shining examples of a company's CSR, which helped revitalize, a community, or even in a micro sense, certain neighborhoods. So it's so critical.
Those are a couple of great examples of, in many senses, a very literal application of the term "license to operate." Here, what I want to speak to is that those are a couple of great big companies that in many respects, the CSR or citizenship programs had paid very significant dividends, and even at a smaller company level, and by almost every measure, we're much smaller than those companies. Those types of concepts and activities also pay dividends for us, and we see it on a pretty regular basis. And I've got a couple of more figurative and one literal application of the term "license to operate." Something we see on a regular basis is our business partnerships with many types of institutions, but nonprofit and government institutions in particular, who are always asking for, what are you doing for our community, or what have you done for the community in which you operate in? You want to bank our municipal government, our school district. You want to, bank our foundation. You want to help manage our investment portfolio. That's great. What else are you doing that complements our vision for a strong local workforce, for example? And we often have to demonstrate that. My team is called on a very regular basis to collaborate with some of our relationship managers and our business development professionals to demonstrate the value that we've provided to a community, a city, a particular community asset. And we do that by responding to RFPs, by going on calls, making presentations to potential clients. So it is a differentiator that these institutions certainly see. In many cases, there are certain, those institutions have bylaws. For example, we see some government institutions that have bylaws that require that if they're going to do business with a financial institution, that financial institution has to have at least a satisfactory rating in the Community Reinvestment Act. And so if you don't, which is a government determination that your investment in your local community has room for improvement, then you might lose that business. So it's really critical. Not as much, but we do also see this with some of our private business customers who also want to work with a company that share their value for the local communities. Another figurative interpretation of the license to operate is just the brand value that it gives us to consumers in particular. Consumers by and large have, any more so today, in particular millennials, place a tremendous amount of value on socially responsible businesses. There are a number of surveys that have been produced and published, results of which have been published, that speak to the consumer value on social responsibility. And a number of them, numbers range from 85% to 93%, somewhere in there based on which survey you're looking at, of consumers who really value CSR and value socially responsible companies, so much so that they'll switch brands. They might even pay more for a product if that company has demonstrated some true value to their community and to their employees and to their customer base through the way that they operate, to the way that they give back. And what that allows us to do is I want to reinforce a point that Mark made earlier, which is a lot of companies are doing really great things. The miss might be not sharing that. And I often say that we can't afford to be anonymously altruistic. We need to find genuine and meaningful ways to share our story, to share our community impact, our shared value with our community partners, and some of the impacts that those have realized. And we try to do so. It's really important to do so in meaningful and organic ways. And then the last thing is, the last piece is this market expansion notion. So that's our footprint there, just a visual representation of where our market is now. And, very literally interpreting the license to operate, if a financial institution in particular wants to expand beyond its footprint, it does have to meet certain standards under the Community Reinvestment Act. It does, and we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically later, but there are certain, and I'm sure we're not the only ones, but there are certain regulations that just don't allow us to expand, or financial institutions to expand, if there hasn't been a demonstrated track record of our investment in our own backyard, in the communities that we have operated in. So that's something to keep in mind. One thing that I would encourage you to think about is that when you're looking to recruit companies, any company, not just a financial institution, of course, but when you're looking to recruit companies, ask yourself, are they currently good corporate citizens? Are they currently providing a meaningful value add to their community beyond the things that any company can the value add that any company can provide through just commerce and job creation? Those are important things to be sure. The additional value add of just having a very socially responsible company operating in your footprint, in your community, should and could be an element of your criteria.
No, thank you, Alec. And I think one of the next pillars we want to talk about is strategic investments. And more and more companies are focusing their CSR, corporate citizenship investments, where they have an economic or strategic interest. An example that we wanted to go through, and I'll speed up a little bit because I know that we're already 45 minutes into this and we want to leave a lot of questions, a lot of time for questions. But the example I wanted to highlight was the Wonderful Company. Now, they have a great name, Wonderful Company. What do they do? Well, one of the things, they do a lot of things. They're an agricultural company out in California, but they are one of the largest makers of pistachios in the world. And you probably have all seen them at your local grocery stores. Wonderful pistachios. They have other products as well. But they're a really neat company. And in the farming community of Lost Hills, California, 50% of the households have at least one person that works at the Wonderful Company. pistachio plant 13 miles away. But the problem with Lost Hills was it was lacking basic infrastructure. It was an agricultural community in the valley. It didn't have streetlights or sidewalks, but the wonderful company said, well, look, most of our employees actually live there, and what can we do to invest in that community? So working with the community members, the wonderful company created a strategy to revitalize Lost Hills, California. The company created a community advisory board and the first town council to help determine how the company should invest. Its in-house capital improvements team led the town's infrastructure improvements, including building parks, streets, driveways, sidewalks, even bus shelters. With an overall investment of just $15 million for the company, it helped restore a strong sense of community and pride in Lost Hills, California. You know, this transformation of the community demonstrates the positive impact of business, just one business, can have on a community by investing resources and fully engaging with the residents. So the wonderful company also provided a small business loan and construction support to a neat little restaurant called Gabby's. And the company helped build it at cost and provided the financing. So again, another example of corporate citizenship. And all these investments, again, really benefited the company, the wonderful company. It benefited Lost Hills, California, but also the employees and residents there. And it wasn't just unique to only wonderful company employees. The other 50% benefited as well. So it's a great platform and an example of how one company can turn around one town. So much so that last year, 2016, we gave them our Best Community Improvement Program Award for that amazing work that they did.
A couple of other examples of strategic investments from our perspective, goes back to that and reflects on that theoretical foundation for social responsibility and corporate citizenship, that you want to find that sweet spot for shared value. And we think that growing consumers, and then on the next slide, we'll talk about growing economies, but growing consumers is an excellent place for shared value with our communities. If you think about financial institutions, people interact with financial institutions when they're at a certain economic threshold, a certain place of financial wellness, for the most part, by and large. And there's a role that we can play, and we're only really going to benefit if we can help, move more people above that threshold. And we feel that there's a significant role we could and should play in help improving the financial health of our communities. Here's just a snapshot of some ways in which we've tried to make that happen. Moving over, starting actually on the right-hand side, we've partnered with this wonderful organization, and not just this is an important example of that, breaking down the silos and not just being a CSR function. Our entire company has partnered with this organization called Operation Hope that operates in many communities throughout the nation, so you might have heard of them. And what they do is they deliver economic empowerment to families and to individuals through financial literacy, through financial education, and through credit counseling and helping people really become financially well through a number of measures. And so our community, our CSR group, our retail footprint, where our bank branches are working, our operations group and our real estate group, our marketing group, we all came together and worked with this group called Operation Hope to actually deliver financial education and credit counseling outside of our branch, right inside of our branch. They have an office right inside our branch. It's their employee, it's their staff member, it's their work, but we support them, we give them space to operate, and we collaborate with them to improve the financial health of, yes, of course, our customers who are coming in and out of our branch, but also just the community that surrounds that branch, because we feel a sense of obligation to that community. And so another example of creating both value to that community when they economically grow and become more financially well, but then of course it's going to create some value for us because they're going to be at a point in their life where they might be able to benefit from a financial institution. So credit counseling is one thing, but just access to credit and growing your credit profile is another thing completely. We recognize that there are places that many financial institutions just can't lend for very valid reasons. We also recognize, though, that credit is an extremely important tool in growing communities. And in this case, the two examples I have of growing wealth for individuals and growing neighborhoods and that's necessary to get a mortgage, yet many people can't get a mortgage from a financial institution. So we view it as our role here to help enable those partners that are providing mortgages in places that banks can't. So just a couple of partnerships to note here. Both of these are organizations that provide mortgages to individuals that traditionally wouldn't be able to get a mortgage from a financial institution. And it is through our investments in these organizations, some substantial investments, not through philanthropy, through investments that we take risk in, investments in loan funds that allow these organizations to provide capital in places banks can't. That way, families are owning a home, they're growing their wealth, we're improving neighborhoods, and we're improving credit scores so that someday those consumers can be bankable. On the next slide here is the same application, but at a small business level or just a local economy level more broadly. Again, small businesses, I'm sure you see this all the time, need to be at a certain threshold or a certain number of years of operations before they can benefit from a bank, but they still need the resources that many financial institutions have to offer. So we partner with and enable many community partners throughout our footprint to provide training and technical assistance and growth, and in many cases credit to small businesses in places where we are just unable to do so. And again, it's a great example of how we can grow our economy by our business maybe not be able to completely fulfill what's needed there. So we find a way for our CSR to complement our business role and really, quite frankly, partner with many economic development organizations in making some of these small business development organizations a reality.
Thank you, Alec. And I'm about to turn it right back to you, but just to highlight number 4 on bridging divides. Companies are finding that CSR or corporate citizenship gives them ways to bring economic, social, and community divides in a way that might not be available in their traditional business. And I think you've got a few more examples that I was hoping you could share.
Yeah, I'll be quick on these as well. What we wanted to talk about here was just that there are 2 different types of community. Not every community is the same, especially when a company has a wide footprint, and you can't really treat every community the same because each faces its own unique challenges. A challenge that we see both in urban and rural communities, and many of you see, are these workforce challenges. In some cases, you have people that need jobs, and which is something that we see in our urban community here in Omaha, is very high unemployment rates in certain pockets of our town, yet much lower unemployment rates, so availability of jobs in other portions of our town. So there was a skills gap. And so we collaborated with the Urban League of Nebraska here in Omaha to not only give them the resources they needed to start and prop up and continue to operate a really unique employment boot camp program, but we've also helped them gear that and channel that employment boot camp program towards an industry that's pretty popular in Omaha. Many say it's popular because we sound like we're from nowhere, which is the customer service industry. And we ourselves have a really solid customer service program where we rely on that workforce. And so not only were we able to prop up that business, or prop up that program rather, and continue to support it, but our human resources group and our customer service team have been collaborating with them to actually provide some of the training, and we've actually hired a handful of people right out of that program. So another example of shared value. So we still have workforce challenges in many of our rural communities, but the reasons we have workforce challenges and what those workforce challenges are much different. Another thing Mark said earlier is that in this case, it's when jobs need to be filled. In some of our communities, Columbus, Nebraska, for example, we might have 500, a really low unemployment rate, and something like 500 good paying jobs available, just no one to fill them. And the problem is twofold. One, a lack of perhaps talent locally, and then also you can't recruit talent because of housing shortages and an inability to construct new homes because there's a significant difference between the cost to build a home and then the value of that home. So it's a really complex problem, and we find ourselves as wanting to participate in solutions to that problem, because if our rural communities dry up, it's not good, of course, for the rural communities and our state as a whole. It's not good for our business or any of the other businesses that are operating there. So partnering with education institutions to invest in manufacturing training programs, which is the type of skill needed, advanced manufacturing, which is the type of skill needed in many of these rural communities. And then partnering with other housing organizations to help figure out and solve that housing challenge so we can recruit employees to those communities. So it's tackling these comparable issues, but in very unique ways and in very locally sensitive ways.
Thank you, Alec. And we've got another example as well, that because of, I'm checking the clock to make sure we don't run out of time, and not because I'm a New England Patriots fan and I just use presenter discretion by nixing my example of Philadelphia as the best practice. But just to give them 2 seconds, Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey are linked by, that river, and what happens in one place has an effect on the other, and in so much that the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Council is helping address those issues and helping both sides of the river understand what's happening on the other, so they can grow as one community, one region. So let's move forward here, and we'll talk about the fifth pillar, the spirit of innovation. As many of you know, the private sector is forward-thinking with partners, and they realize the issues we face today are only going to be solved by out-of-the-box collaboration. If it was easy, it would have been done already. So we're seeing an increase in these non-traditional partnerships, especially business-to-business partnerships that have a strategic focus on solving critical social issues. So we've got just a few more examples that we wanted to share with you. The first one we're involved in is our Beyond 34 project in Orlando, Florida. And you might be thinking, what in the world is Beyond 34 and what does that mean? Unfortunately, the US recycling rate has been stuck at 34% for 20 years. It's shocking, but it's not just a feel-good activity. It is actually good for business, and it's good for the environment. And again, there's that shared value component. So quickly, we've launched a pilot in Orlando. We gathered a bunch of businesses who have a stake in this to have this pilot work so it can be scaled across the country. These partners include Coca-Cola, Dow Chemical Company, Target, Walgreens, the Walmart Foundation, and Republic Services, which is the disposal company that is contracted with the city. We've partnered with the mayor and his administration, as well as the Orlando Chamber of Commerce and others, to really take these best practices, get them to work better in Orlando, and then export them across the country. And we really think it's this example of collaboration that can show that businesses can work together in a pre-competitive space, but they're solving a big societal problem. And if Orlando is first to market on something like this, well, that's just another opportunity for the Orlando area to pat themselves on the back, attract new companies, keep the ones that they've got, because they'll be a cleaner and more environmentally friendly city. Makes sense, all the sense in the world.
We also have some innovative partnerships with our local Chamber of Commerce here in Omaha that we wanted to share with you, because what we want you to take away from here is that number one, how can you leverage this information to find ways to create value add with some of the private sector companies when thinking about how they might approach social responsibility and citizenship locally. And we also wanted to hopefully inspire you with some of these examples to think through ideas in which you yourselves or other partners as well could find ways to collaborate with some local institutions. And here's a couple of ways in which we've collaborated with our local economic development organization. 3 ways in particular I'll point out. Number one, it's just supporting that standard multi-year economic development strategy, which that in and itself isn't innovative. But I do want to point out that we find that those broad sweeping, broad-based economic development strategies and our multi-year commitment to those are foundational to our support with economic development partners. And I'm hopeful that you can use this as a way to both convince some local partners to participate in such strategies that you have that maybe haven't before, or even encourage some to participate at a greater level when you can demonstrate that shared value that you provide to them. We've also then, beyond that, have had 2 innovative things that are underway or in the pipeline with our local chamber. One is we actually collaborated with our local chamber to start a whole new organization. We recognize that the way in which our underserved neighborhoods were developing were very myopic. It was very myopic, I should say, that organizations were tackling housing challenges or education challenges or workforce challenges and it was kind of a scattered shot approach across some of our more blighted areas of our city. And what we realized and recognized is that it is the neighborhoods that have all strengths and assets, the ones we talked about earlier, are the ones that are going to be economically and socially sustainable and successful. And so we recognized that there was a deficiency in our ecosystem when it came to responding to that and delivering that kind of community and economic development solutions. So together, hand in hand, we in the Chamber studied the landscape, looked for other organizations that maybe approach things differently, and over a period of about 18 months, actually developed a new organization, recruited a board, have hired a CEO, and have a strategic plan in place, and we're ready to go with executing some of these things. So we came together to actually form an organization and both invested generous resources into making it happen. The other thing is we also collectively recognize the value that financial technology or fintech companies have to our company and to our local community. And so right now, this is the pipeline example, or we're thinking through ways in which we collectively can invest in the fintech vertical in our local ecosystem. And so that's another way in which we're trying to, at a very high level and in a very meaningful way, trying to collaborate with our economic development organization to grow that industry in particular.
Thank you, Alex. And, here's the wrap up. All right, we wanted to leave you with 4 things to remember. So, these examples are takeaways, and then we'll move into Q&A. But I think that if you walk away from this webinar with 4 things to remember, but also to do, perhaps we've been successful. So, first and foremost, when you think about corporate social responsibility and corporate citizenship, it's not about charity anymore. It really isn't. And so I hope these examples show that traditional philanthropy is just one part of the entire spectrum, and the reasons and ways businesses invest in corporate citizenship and CSR are as diverse as the businesses themselves. So when you're looking to establish or expand a partnership or work with a company, please keep this in mind. These businesses today, they want to be active partners in the success of their entire community because it's the right thing to do, and it's a good thing to do for their company. Second, again, consider these non-traditional partners. Alec had great examples. We've got some examples. Again, if it was easy, it would have been done already. So think outside the box and think outside your comfort zone because you don't have to agree on everything. But if you can agree on one thing, you ought to try it together. And then, next, we haven't talked about this, but this new reality of tax reform, whether you're for it, against it, understand that companies are benefiting from it. So just here at the Chamber Foundation, we've tracked more than 350 very large companies that have made public announcements about wage increases, community and infrastructure investments as a result of this tax reform. And to that point, they've announced over $3 billion that has been committed to community investment. Sometimes that's supporting a charity, or sometimes that's supporting the community in other ways. So it's going to impact everywhere. And make sure that as you're talking to your community leaders, as well as the private sector where you're doing business, ask them how they're going to reinvest that money. And chances are you're going to have additional resources at your disposal to address some of the social issues that we talked about. And then lastly, and Alex is going to take this one.
But the last point is just to know the regulatory factors that are at play with many of these companies that might also have an influence in where they spend some of their resources, their time, their focus, their energy, or maybe even dictate some things that they should or should not do. And if you understand those things, then you can leverage them in a way that'll help create and propel that shared value. So an easy one for me to speak to is the Community Reinvestment Act and how financial institutions are having to invest in the growth of businesses, in the growth of local economies, and in the growth of local neighborhoods. So if that's a focus for you, how can you leverage what financial institutions are capable of doing? Many environmental regulations also dictate that there are investments that are made in a way that are meaningful and valuable to the long-term success and the long-term sustainment of your community. So how can companies play value in that? And then there are some legal actions to pay attention to. And if companies are need to make up for past discretions or anything of that nature, how can you be a partner in helping them do that and helping them right any wrong? So just some things to pay attention to there.
Thank you, Alec, and thank you, everyone. We really hope you took away from this discussion about how these companies, and through their CSR and corporate citizenship efforts, can really be an important partner as you think about economic development in the communities. It's good for everyone, and I think it's a win-win. And to the extent that either Alec or I can be helpful talking to you in this Q&A, or even offline, we'd be delighted to do so. So Michelle, I think we're going to turn it back to you to kind of open up the line, and we'll take some questions for a little bit, and then we'll be on our way.
All right, well, thanks, Mark and Alec. Thank you for that presentation. And yes, for all of you watching, feel free to get those questions in. You can type them into the questions box, and we'll read them off as they come in. So for our first question, it's directed to Mark, but Alec, even as you listen, if you would like to chip in, you're welcome to. It says, as an entity that supports industry, have your members expressed a need for greater levels of corporate social responsibility based on demand from their investors, or is this movement being pushed more by consumers?
Well, it's both, right? And I would say many of the companies that we work with are way ahead on this. So they understand their role in society. They understand shared value. They're doing the right thing, and they're being rewarded for it, both in the markets, but also in their communities, and I would say also with their customers. So I'm not gonna say that every company is doing this, but one of our missions here at the Chamber Foundation is to highlight those that are and the best practices and how they're doing it. So maybe we can shortcut this whole process for the companies who are just stepping up to bat, where they're able to get involved too and have significant impact, but also see significant reward.
Okay, thank you. The next question, and both of you are welcome to chime in. How can companies use the corporate social responsibility framework to stay ahead of regulators like the EPA, OSHA, FDA? So how can they use this framework to stay ahead?
Alec, you want to take that one first, or?
Yeah, I can take a crack at it. Speaking more broadly, if you have don't give them a reason to need to regulate your behavior first and foremost. And so if the industry can, in whatever industry it is, can self-police and demonstrate that, and it shouldn't always be viewed as self-policing. I don't want it to come off that way. It should be a sense of duty, I think, in many cases, and that's something. It should be a sense of duty. It should create a shared value, but you should also be able to look out on the horizon and ensure that we're just acting and behaving in a way that is appropriate and respectful to consumers and to investors. And if we know it's out there, then we're going to be able to more appropriately avoid perhaps any of that regulation. I think that's one way I'd tackle it. Mark, you have anything to add there?
And I would just say generally, whenever you're doing the right thing, you're de-risking, right? So whatever agency it is of the federal, state, or local government, if you're doing the right thing and talking about it in the right way, and doing it for the right reason, chances are you're de-risking, intervention by government entities. So again, these companies, they understand that, but that's not the only reason they're doing it, right? I mean, they're doing it because, and this is one of the things that we say here a lot. What is the definition of a sustainable company? It's a company that's going to be around for the next generation. And the only way you get to do that is if you're able to, be a good corporate citizen, to be a steward of the environment, to serve the communities in which you have presence, and take care of your employees. So if you're doing all those things, I would submit to you that you have a competitive advantage over a company that is not. And over the long run, that's going to be recognized by the aforementioned stakeholders.
I'll add one more thing to that is I said something earlier, and the context was different, but it's very applicable here. What I said earlier was that you cannot be anonymously altruistic, and that was in reference to how you communicate with your consumers. The very same goes for either your regulators or just your delegation that represents you and represents your interest. And so to be transparent and open about the things that you're doing, the things that you're proud of, the things that your employees are doing, and how you do act, you are a good corporate citizen, and getting out in front of that and sharing those stories with your delegation where appropriate, I think would also be a great strategy.
Okay, thanks to you both. Our next question, it reads, is there any % of the corporate revenue that's recommended to corporate social responsibility? So is there any percentage of corporate revenue that's recommended that you know of?
So first, I think you've got to go back and say, how do you measure your CSR spend, if you will? Because it's just not, as we talked about, it's just not cutting checks to charities, right? That's a piece of it. But what about your employees' volunteer time? What about the products and services that you offer? Is that actually having a societal benefit? So it's hard to measure that way. There are some countries around the world that actually have set a target number, and it's pretty controversial. Not that they're trying to do the wrong thing. I think they're trying to do the right thing, but maybe they're just going about it the wrong way. So, what we think here at the Chamber Foundation is the stakeholders will decide whether you're an investor, you're a government, you're an employee, a consumer in any way. They'll know what's right if they pay attention. And I think that's incumbent upon all of us to understand and reward the companies that are doing good things. And to Alex's point, these companies, they should talk about it. They should talk about the things that they're doing. And those that are not talking about it, well, perhaps their silence is telling you something.
I'll add here, Mark, I don't know what you think of this resource, but I'll throw it out there. I think it's, I got to jot it down. CECP, I think it stands for Center for Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy membership organization, and they're not just about philanthropy. My review of them has been that they reflect many of the things that we've talked about here today, and they have a great report that kind of looks at the industry and how, when an industry is operating as a good corporate citizen, how are they doing it? What are the best practices that they're delivering, and what are some of the benchmarks, not just in philanthropy, but across the board, across all the things that we talked about. What is your strategy? Are you focused in the right areas that reflect the shared value? How do you deliver that? How are your employees a part of that? What are you doing financially as a part of that? And so there are industry benchmarks, which I think is a great document to look to help guide where the levels that, if you are trying to level set a little bit, but don't restrict yourself to that. But it is a good document to help orient yourself a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, our viewer writes, Mark, I appreciate the reference to risk reduction as an outcome of being a good corporate citizen. Many companies don't see it this way. In this regard, how can you encourage CEOs to place public health experts in the C-suite where decisions are being made?
Well, look, I think it's situational. If you're a healthcare company, you already have someone like that at your fingertips for their advice and interaction. So, should there be a healthcare professional in the C-suite? I'm not sure I would agree with that. Should they have healthcare stakeholders advising the company at some level? Again, I think smart companies would say, yes, we'll do that. And if companies don't do it, well, that's a risk that they should be, they should acknowledge the risk that they're taking.
Okay. Alec, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, Mark had a great response there.
Okay. All right. So I guess what would both of you say for an economic development organization who wants to get the conversation started with maybe a couple of the top businesses within their community? What would you say are just like the top 3 starting points that they should consider to getting that conversation going?
Well, first I would say call your local chamber. It's their business to know the business in that community, and they can be a terrific guide to help you map out the best organizations to talk to, those that can have significant impact, those who kind of get it. And I think a lot of it can flow from there, but I wouldn't limit it to the local chamber or private sector. I mean, this is a whole of community approach. So, you know, if you're not already engaged, I'm going to imagine you as an IEDC member, you would be, your local government stakeholders, but also understand that, you know, nonprofits have a role to play because they can actually address some of these social challenges if they're resourced appropriately.
One thing I would say is that understand that particular organization, that particular business's business proposition, and then understand what the shared value is in their community. Some are very explicit and transparent about it and makes that easy for you. This is what we do in business. This is what where that shared value is for us, and so they're pretty cut and dry. Others maybe not so much, and others maybe aren't as active, but if you demonstrate and you approach them and you engage them in a way that demonstrates that what you're doing complements their business and advances that shared value, then you've got a good argument there. But you might have to just think creatively about how you engage a particular company, and you have to be able to plot what that shared value is, because the question, what's in it for me, is always at the top of everybody's mind. And if you can lead with that, then hopefully it'll be a path to success for you.
Okay, our next question, can you expand on the practice of strategically funding regional or municipal planning efforts? Examples would be helpful.
I guess I was the one that ended with this, I think, a little bit. So, it's a standard practice for us to fund those regional or local, citywide, and I guess the question was planning efforts. I'm applying this to more economic development strategies, but it's a practice for us because if we look at the components of many of those economic development strategies, it is housing, it is workforce, it is neighborhoods, it is the local business environment, it is recruitment, it is retention, and all of those things are operating on all cylinders for us. So for us, it's just been a standard practice. When we think about how much we participate in those things, I think is also a question that is relevant and something to consider when you're engaging a partner. You don't want to scare anybody off. So if you focus on the shared value, that's one thing, but then to what extent should someone participate in? And we often look at so this is where the word responsibility, I think, does come into play. I like the way Mark differentiated responsibility and citizenship, but we do look at it as, what's our responsibility to participate in this project, in this particular project, or this plan, or this initiative? Because we are one element of this community. We're one citizen of this community, and we don't think that we should have the entire the responsibility to fund something in its entirety. But what's our share? What should our share be? And so it's often we approach things. Should we be 1% of this project? Should we be 10% of this project? It just depends on how big we are in that community and how big that community is to our business as a whole. So the way we might approach our participation in the Omaha Chamber's economic development strategy is much different than the way we might approach our participation in the economic development strategy of a rural community. Especially rural community where we might have a much smaller market share. In Omaha, it's a 50% market share. In rural community A, it's a 5% market share. So the share of our participation in that particular economic development plan or project is not, and we view, in our philosophy, it should not be equal. And so being aware of that mindset, I think, might be appropriate when approaching companies for engagement in that. I hope that answered the question.
No, that was great, Alec. That was great. Thank you. And I guess to narrow, our next question is a little bit more focused. But the viewer asked, how can public health practitioners like me work with economic developers as they negotiate options with companies that want to locate in their communities?
Well, that actually might be best addressed by IEDC.
If any of you had any insight into that.
Well, look, I think smart business people understand that the health of their employees really will help dictate the success of their company. And when you expand that out to the next concentric circle, it's the health of the employees and their families. And then one more circle, it's the health of the community. And those are the examples that we saw in Oklahoma City. These are the examples that we saw in Philadelphia and Camden, and other places where it really matters. If you're able to, generate, this culture of health in particular communities, again, using the example of the local mayor or governor or even the Chamber of Commerce executive saying, we're the best educated, have the best infrastructure. They need to start saying we're a healthy community. That smart business leaders will understand that as a signal that this is a good place to be. And I would continue to pound that home with any of the stakeholders that help market a community and have the metrics behind it to prove it.
Health is certainly not our, and it's something that we do engage in some instances, but not does not drive a lot of our activities. What I really like, though, is that Mark provided two examples earlier. I believe it was the one in Oklahoma City, and then I think it was the Wonderful Company, had some over intersection with health and infrastructure too. And I think those are great examples to think through and how that might be applied to another local company or a health practitioner for that matter, I believe was the originator of the question.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're winding down to the last few minutes for the webinar. So to Mark and Alec, I'll give you guys one last opportunity if you have any final lasting remarks that you'd like to leave with our attendees today.
Sure, Alec, do you want to go first, or would like me to?
Yeah, sure. I think that's appropriate. I think we should end with you. I made this comment earlier, and I'll just reinforce that is that economic development organizations, you guys you employ a variety of strategies to make our economy strong and thriving, and in many respects you probably engage your private sector partners in making those strategies become a reality. And we hope, and I hope, and we hope certainly that this was some insight in how private sector companies might approach in the mindset that they have when engaging with economic development organizations or any organization in their community that's contributing to the strength of the local economy. But the comment I want to make is that when engaging community partners, or I'm sorry, when working on both recruitment, retention efforts, and just some of that economic gardening efforts, to instill this same perspective in the minds of those companies that you're working with and growing, and encourage them to be active and active members of the community beyond just what they do day in and day out as of course a great company, but to do so in a way that reflects many of the citizenship and social responsibility values and components we talked about here. If every one of our companies, and many companies do, and if every single one of them operated with this perspective, just think about how much greater and better off we would all be.
Yeah, Alec, you're exactly right. And a lot of the examples that we talked about here at the Chamber Foundation, these are really large companies, but you don't need to have a really large company to have such a positive impact. I mean, if you just engage, and again, I would encourage it through the local chamber, but it doesn't, again, you don't have to, but they certainly have the map of the community in terms of the private sector. To have these companies, their quote unquote CSR spend really leveraged, and it's leveraged towards economic development. Because if you get the social determinants of a community pointing in the right direction, that community can really take off. And the counterpoint to that is if they're pointing in the wrong direction, you know how hard that is to grow a community economically. So it really does matter. And I think if companies haven't rationalized this, you can be a voice in that discussion, and we'd be happy to have that discussion with you as well, to talk companies through why this really makes a difference.
Well, Mark and Alec, thank you both today. You guys have shared just a wealth of information with us this afternoon. And to our attendees, thank you for tuning in. Before we go, I would like to remind you all to visit IEDC's website. We do have an upcoming webinar next month, Fighting Neighborhood Decay from Blight to Bright. And that will be Thursday, March 8th, same time from 2:30 to 4 Eastern. So again, you can visit iedconline.org. Also, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, either about the webinar today, maybe there's some additional questions that come up afterwards that you would like us to pass on to our speakers. We'd be more than happy to facilitate that discussion, or any other questions. Feel free to contact us at webinar@iedconline.org. So again, thank you to everyone. And I hope you all are able to apply a lot of this great advice in your communities. So thank you.